California. This state got absolutely demolished during the Great War, with Los Angeles and San Francisco taking multiple direct nuclear hits that left massive craters across the state. The Boneyard, what used to be LA, turned into a graveyard of broken skyscrapers and deadly radiation stretching for miles. But California had one advantage that helped it survive. Vault-Tec ran their entire operation there, which meant it ended up with more underground vaults than anywhere else in the country. Some of these vaults were actually designed to help people, while others were twisted experiments, like Vault 12 in Bakersfield that had a broken door on purpose just to study what radiation would do to the people inside. Despite all the destruction, the vaults gave enough people shelter to eventually rebuild, and California ended up becoming the most successful region in post-war America. Small settlements like Shady Sands, The Hub, and Junktown slowly grew over the decades until they finally joined together in 2189 to form the new California Republic. This was the first real government with actual laws and a constitution since the bombs had dropped, and under President Tandy's leadership, it grew into the biggest political force in the wasteland. The NCR helped the Vault Dweller destroy the Master's super mutant army in 2161, beat back the Enclave when they tried to wipe out humanity in 2241, and even survived a brutal war with the Brotherhood of Steel. But all that success made them complacent, and by the 2270s, they'd pushed too far east into the Mojave, bleeding soldiers and resources trying to hold territory they couldn't actually control. Then in 2277, Shady Sands got nuked again, turning the city that started the whole republic into rubble and throwing everything into chaos. California's story is basically a cycle: getting destroyed, rebuilding into something powerful, getting too confident, and then getting destroyed all over again. Nevada. This state had the weirdest survival story of any state, and it's all because one man was obsessed with planning for the end of the world. Robert House built a defense network around Las Vegas that managed to shoot down 68 out of 77 incoming nuclear warheads on October 23, 2077, which saved the city while the rest of America burned to ash. Meanwhile, the surrounding Mojave Desert wasn't so lucky and got hammered by fallout and the total collapse of everything, but Vegas itself stood relatively intact with most of its buildings still standing. House's defense system took damage during the attack and put him into a coma for 5 years, so when he finally woke up in 2138, he found his precious city occupied by various tribes living in the ruins. He spent the next few decades carefully manipulating these tribes into becoming the 3 families who would run his casinos on the Strip, turning savages into dealers and security guards by 2274. By 2281, Nevada had become a 3-way war zone between House's independent New Vegas, the NCR pushing in from California, and Caesar's Legion marching west from Arizona. Massachusetts. It survived the Great War mostly by accident, since Boston wasn't hit by the same concentrated bombing that destroyed other major cities. One massive nuclear detonation southwest of the city created the Glowing Sea, a permanently radioactive crater that still spews radiation storms 200 years later. But the rest of Boston's infrastructure remained mostly standing. This didn't stop society from collapsing within weeks anyway, because it turns out you don't need direct nuclear hits when everything else falls apart on its own. The state had 5 Vault-Tec installations running various experiments, including Vault 111, where they froze people in cryogenic pods for 210 years, and Vault 75, where they quietly murdered any children who didn't meet their genetic standards. The real nightmare started underground at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, where scientists survived the war and eventually created the institute. These scientists spent the next 2 centuries playing God beneath MIT, developing synthetic humans that looked exactly like real people and accidentally unleashing super mutants across the region as a side project. By 2287, the Commonwealth had turned into a complete war zone with Diamond City inside Fenway Park as the largest settlement, caught between the Institute replacing people with synths, the Brotherhood of Steel shaking down locals for supplies, and raiders everywhere. West Virginia. It avoided most nuclear strikes during the Great War because it lacked strategic targets, but that just meant it survived long enough to face something far worse. Within decades of the bombs falling, a crystalline infection called the Scorched Plague swept through Appalachia, spread by mutated bats that turned people into mindless burning creatures and wiped out every faction that tried to stop it. The responders, Free States, and even the Brotherhood of Steel chapter established there all fell to the plague, with the Brotherhood launching one desperate assault on the Scorched Beast nests in 2095 called Operation Touchdown, before the creatures overran their bases and killed them all. When Vault 76 opened in 2102 and new Brotherhood forces arrived decades later, they found a beautiful region rich with resources, but still cursed by the same plague that had destroyed everyone who came before. Maryland. The state of Maryland got carved up by the Great War and never bothered putting itself back together. Point Lookout in southern Maryland became known as a haunted, isolated region, cut off from the rest of the wasteland, and developing its own strange post-war culture. The state saw enough destruction that survivors like Russell Dorsey eventually headed west looking for better opportunities, while others like Beckett and his brother grew up playing in destroyed factories where rabid dogs attacked them. Western Maryland's correctional facility became the origin point for the Free Radicals, a hostile group that spread chaos across the region. Maryland just fell apart and stayed that way, which is pretty much all the information we have on the state in the game. Virginia. So this state took the full force of Washington, D.C.'s nuclear bombardment, which completely destroyed the northern regions. But the state's real nightmare came from Vault 87, where residents got exposed to the forced evolutionary virus to create super mutants for military purposes. The experiment worked too well. The resulting super mutants escaped the vault after either executing or converting the inhabitants, then spent the next 2 centuries terrorizing the wasteland and kidnapping people to be dunked into FEV vats. This made Virginia deadly in 2 ways. Areas that weren't completely irradiated were crawling with super mutants hunting for victims. Meanwhile, any habitable spots got picked clean within years, leaving nothing but ruins for later survivors. Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh avoided direct nuclear hits during the Great War, but the city's industrial infrastructure combined with irradiated rivers created something worse. Abraxo drain cleaner expanded in the radiation and created the troglodyte degeneration contagion, a disease that turned people into feral creatures called trogs. This contamination transformed Pittsburgh into the Pit, where raider gangs used slave labor to keep the steel mills running. The Brotherhood of Steel launched Operation Scourge in 2255 to clean out the city, basically killing most of the population in a massive assault. One paladin named Ishmael Asher got left behind and somehow survived, eventually building his own slave-based empire. By the 2270s, the Pit had become notorious for its gladiatorial arena, where slaves fought for freedom but mostly just died for entertainment. Arizona. The state was hit by targeted strikes during the Great War. For decades afterward, Arizona was a complete mess, where every settlement fought its neighbors just to survive. Raiders overran Arizona so badly that people couldn't even trade with nearby towns without getting killed, leaving the whole region in constant violence. Everything changed in 2247 when Edward Sallow, famously known as Caesar, and Joshua Graham got captured by the Blackfoot tribe. Sallow transformed these struggling people into Caesar's Legion, building an army that swept across Arizona and either killed or absorbed 86 different tribes. The Legion's brutal methods actually turned Arizona into one of the safest places for travelers, since they either scared off or crucified every raider they found. By 2281, the Legion controlled all of Arizona, creating the most powerful military force east of the Colorado River. New Mexico. By 2281, Caesar's Legion controlled all of New Mexico. Caesar himself mentioned the state as part of the Legion's expansion, and a woman named Siri tells the courier she came from a small town in the state before the Legion burned it and enslaved her. Dale Barton, a trader operating near the Hoover Dam, explains that trading with the NCR costs too much, so he sticks with doing business in Arizona and New Mexico instead. While the Legion proved to be a menace, they surely kept the trade routes secure in the region. The state's fate mirrors Arizona's. Tribal communities that survived the Great War eventually faced conquest by the Legion, with towns either submitting to Caesar's rule or being destroyed. Utah. Utah got hit unevenly during the Great War. Salt Lake City took 13 nuclear warheads within 7 minutes, turning the city into a crater of fire and charred skeletons. Meanwhile, Zion National Park somehow avoided strikes entirely, staying as one of the few places where water was clean and land wasn't poisoned. Salt Lake's ruins got picked over for decades, with scavengers grabbing everything including old police equipment that eventually ended up on people like Joshua Graham. By the 2280, the city was crawling with giant mantises and mutated creatures, making it completely uninhabitable. New Canaan, a Mormon settlement near the ruins, thrived for years until Caesar's Legion ordered the White Legs tribe to destroy it as a loyalty test. This pushed survivors into Zion Canyon, where they fought alongside the Sorrows and Dead Horses tribes against the White Legs. The conflict peaked in 2281 when the courier arrived and had to choose between defending Zion through violence or convincing everyone to abandon it. Colorado. Colorado fell under Caesar's Legion during their aggressive eastward expansion from Arizona. The conquest wasn't peaceful. Ulysses described how Legate Lanius put Colorado to the sword, suggesting the Legion used extreme violence to break whatever resistance existed in the state. Dale Barton's willingness to trade in the region suggested the Legion established their usual system, safe routes for commerce in exchange for absolute obedience to Caesar's law. Whatever communities survived the Great War in Colorado either submitted to the Legion or got wiped out, turning the state into another piece of Caesar's growing territory in the Southwest. New York. New York took confirmed nuclear strikes on the day of the Great War and suffered catastrophic damage. The few people who mention the state paint a grim picture of what's left. Adelaide describes New York City as a big crater, particularly the areas around Broadway. Nathan Broadhurst, a former professional baseball player who survived the Great War in Boston, heard from other survivors that New York was worse off than where they came from, which says something considering Boston's devastation. 2 centuries later, the city's reputation hasn't improved. Giuseppe Della Ripa mentions living in New York at some point, hinting that some areas outside the blast zones might be inhabitable, but no detailed information exists about what actually survived. New Jersey. The nuclear war hit New Jersey hard, with Atlantic City getting slammed by massive flooding that drowned huge parts of the old resort town. The Pine Barrens got it even worse though, where radiation turned the forests into something nightmarish, creating the overgrown, a parasitic plant that could actually infect people and animals. The Barrens also became home to the Jersey Devil, a deadly creature that hunted through both the wilderness and the flooded city streets, but somehow, New Jersey bounced back faster than most places. Atlantic City pulled itself together under Mayor Timothy Lane, who set up a 3-way government between the Moonies, the Showmen, and the Lombardi family crime syndicate. These 3 groups working together managed to get clean water flowing again, keep the power on, grow food on farms outside the city, run emergency services, and even provide entertainment that brought in traders and visitors. People still lived in the Pine Barrens too, Joey Bello calling them Pineys, just like before the war, even with all the dangers lurking around. And naturally, New Jersey still caught jokes from other wastelanders. One popular crack asked whether waking up in Hoboken was worse than the apocalypse. Oregon. After the war, Oregon's fate stayed unclear for decades, though survivors in coastal towns like Coos Bay dealt with massive flooding that turned the area into what one resident called a soggy-ass flooded town before leaving for the East Coast. Southern Oregon eventually became a wild country filled with geckos, and hunting these creatures became a major way to make money for settlements like Klamath and the scattered tribes in the area. This also made Oregon a favorite target for the Slavers Guild from New California, who captured isolated tribal communities for profit. Around 2161, the Vault Dwellers started Arroyo after defeating the Unity, adding another tribal village to the region. One thing both groups agreed on was their hatred of the cannibal groups roaming the wilderness, making Oregon's post-war world as dangerous as it was divided. Texas. Texas's fate after the Great War remains largely a mystery, with even wastelanders like John Cassidy openly wondering if the state survived at all. Cassidy supposedly left his family later in life trying to reach Texas, though nobody knows if he ever made it. What little we know comes from scattered references, a pre-war baseball championship where Boston was crushing a Texas team 3-0 before the bombs dropped, or the death car in the Vicky and Vance casino that still carries bullet holes from a shootout in Plano, Texas. The state left its mark on wasteland culture in other ways too, with the Desert Rangers tracing their lawman heritage directly back to the legendary Texas Rangers. Red Raptor Firearms, a pre-war weapons manufacturer based in Austin, also produced gear that found its way across the post-war world. People like Tex Rogers tried returning home after the war, but eventually joined the Brotherhood of Steel after talking with one of the members. But beyond these fragments, the fate of Texas remains a mystery. Illinois. Chicago got bombed during the Great War, and its industrial areas took heavy damage, leaving the city dangerous centuries later. Despite this, the city remained inhabited, with families like young Tommy settling there and making lives in the ruins. Tommy and his parents even helped repair a passing iBot named EDE using a pre-war Illinois license plate, showing that survivors were resourceful enough to adapt old-world tech. It's surprising, though, that for a state as popular as Illinois, this is the only information presented in the game. Missouri. This state shows up mostly in Fallout Tactics, making much of its story semi-canonical at best. After the war, Missouri became home to several bases for the Unity remnants, super mutants led by Gamoran who fled east after their defeat in California. Kansas City developed its own strange post-war society called Gravestone, a settlement populated entirely by ghouls who worshipped an undetonated nuclear bomb. Ohio. Ohio seems to have survived as a somewhat dangerous but inhabited wasteland, though calling it survival might be generous. Columbus got hit hard during the Great War. With its famous stadium, the Horseshoe turned into a crater, while southeastern Ohio's Burning Springs region went from forests to a radiated desert. The Ghoul summed it up best when he described pre-war Ohio as unimpressive and noted it hasn't improved since. Alaska. This state was the main battleground for the Sino-American War, with Anchorage seeing brutal fighting as Chinese forces invaded from 2066 until getting pushed out in January 2077. The war got so intense, the military designed Liberty Prime specifically to help retake Alaska, though they never finished building it in time. American forces fought all the way from Anchorage to China, with factories constantly shipping weapons north to support the campaign. When the bombs dropped on October 23rd, peace talks were actually happening in freshly liberated Anchorage, collapsing that same morning as the nuclear exchange began. Chinese bombers were spotted off the Bering Strait at 3:37 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, just hours before the first warhead struck. Alaska's fate after that remains unknown, though the state had already been devastated by years of conventional warfare before the nukes even fell. Maine. The state of Maine avoided direct nuclear strikes, but ended up with permanent fog that never clears. The state lives in endless twilight where sun can't break through, creating an eerie atmosphere matching the locals' hostility. The settlement of Far Harbor was set on Mount Desert Island, and the people there constantly dealt with radioactive fog, synth refugees, and conflicts between humans and the Children of Adam cult. Maine pretty much stayed isolated after the war. Wyoming. The state doesn't appear in any Fallout games, but gets mentioned as a destination for groups leaving the Mojave. If convinced to seek their own future, the Great Khans migrate north into Wyoming's plains during the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. The Whitelegs also fled into Wyoming after being defeated by Joshua Graham and the Dead Horses in Utah. Half their tribe died in the first winter, and the remnants scattered to the winds the following spring. Whatever Wyoming became after the war, it's clearly harsh enough to break tribes that couldn't handle its conditions. Idaho. This state only gets one mention in the Fallout lore. If the Great Khans remain allied with Caesar's Legion when the NCR wins the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, the remnants of the tribe are driven north into the wilderness of Idaho. This description makes sense. Idaho's mountainous terrain and lack of major cities probably spared it from direct nuclear strikes, but the harsh landscape and isolation meant no organized communities formed. Montana. The only real information about Montana comes from a few character mentions. The Lonesome Drifter came from the direction of Montana, where he lived with his mother after his father abandoned them. She eventually died from hardship in the wasteland. In New Vegas, if the courier is male with the ladykiller perk, there's a dialogue option suggesting they might have visited Montana and gotten someone pregnant roughly 17 years before 2281. So that tells us the state survived. That's all that's known about post-war Montana. Connecticut. Connecticut doesn't show up much in Fallout lore. Lance Ames reported being in the state when the bombs dropped, though there's no record of what happened to him after. Gilbert Hobson, a former teacher you can find in Appalachia, was from Monroe, Connecticut. The biggest mention comes from Nathan Broadhurst and Jim Walker, two baseball players who survived the Great War in Boston. While heading south to reach family in West Virginia, they joined up with the survivor group in Hartford that was headed for Pittsburgh. The group later split up in Pennsylvania. That's about all the information we have on this state, but if we're looking at things geographically, Connecticut's position between Boston and New York meant it suffered from fallout even if it avoided direct strikes. Florida. This state's entire presence comes from a bartender's joke. Herschel Klein mentions one of his regulars claims to have seen Paladin Romani performing a trapeze act in Florida, obviously mocking the Brotherhood. Now, there's very limited information in the game for this state, but in real life, Florida's low elevation and extensive coastline would have flooded Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville after a nuclear strike. Meanwhile, the Everglades would be a toxic radioactive swamp. The state has a pretty warm climate though, so the distance from northern strike zones might have allowed some inland communities to survive in isolation. Georgia. The state of Georgia appears only in brief mentions from post-war characters and pre-war records. A factory foreman in Fallout 4 mentions starting their military career in Georgia, while Jenny Brown in Fallout 76 compares Appalachia's humidity to what she experienced back in the state. Pre-war records mention Matt Murtaugh, a baseball player for the Boston Swatters in 2077 who came from Atlanta. Because of Georgia's landmass, rural areas probably survived after the bombs dropped. It would have been similar to the scattered communities of Appalachia. Hawaii. Thomas Davis, a bowling champion from Bar Harbor, was deployed to Hawaii in 2075 and promised to send pineapples back to his friends. He kept sending postcards for a while, but suddenly stopped in April, likely when global communication infrastructure collapsed entirely. It's not hard to imagine that the small island of Hawaii was completely destroyed by the nukes. Pearl Harbor was targeted in World War II, and even far back in history, people already had their eyes on the island, so a calculated nuclear strike would have made sense for Hawaii. Iowa. Everything we know about the state comes from a single holotape entry found at the National Isolated Radio Array. In 2076, Dr. Constance Nichols was working on data sonification research at the facility, filtering out background noise from stellar phenomena picked up by the array. Beyond that, however, all of her entries were dated before the Great War happened, so we don't really know what happened to the state after. We can assume that because the state was agricultural, the cornfields would have failed quickly from the radiation. And without industrial farming infrastructure, Iowa might have survived for a few years, but eventually died out because of the contaminated soil. Kansas. The state of Kansas has one of the most interesting lore surrounding it, even though the information about the place itself is almost non-existent. One of the references that can be found was from Ken, a survivor in the pit. Due to the fear of being attacked by trogs, he mentions traveling to Topeka in a letter addressed to a fellow survivor named Marnie. In another instance, Elliot in Fallout 76 has a partner named Spence who's stuck in Kansas. Giles Sweetwater mentions the world's biggest ball of twine being located in Kansas, though he notes there's controversy over the claim. So just based on that, we can assume Kansas is at least habitable. Kentucky. While there's not a lot of detail surrounding this state, there's strong evidence that this state is habitable. A woman named Sophie Wagoner mentions living on a commune in this state as a child. Another one is from the pre-war military weapons company Independent Arms Group, headquartered in Liberty, Kentucky. Now that's about everything we know about the state. Post-war, Kentucky might have survived better than the coasts because of its lack of major cities. Besides Louisville, this is probably why there's a commune there. Louisiana. Louisiana's only appearance comes from one character background. Initiate Ellison was born there before his family moved to West Virginia when he was young. The fact that his family fled Louisiana for Appalachia suggests the state became unlivable enough to drive residents away, even to regions facing their own dangers. On top of that, New Orleans had a low elevation, and that meant the city likely drowned completely when levees failed. The bayous would have become toxic radioactive swamps, and oil refineries drew strikes that turned Louisiana into an abandoned, flooded nightmare. Minnesota. The only reference to Minnesota in the entire Fallout franchise comes from a fictional character mentioned in an advertisement. A terminal in Vault 21's gift shop advertises pool sets with the tagline, "Hustle it like Minnesota Fats," referring to a made-up pool player from a pre-war novel. Even though there's not much information about the state of Minnesota in the game, there's a good reason for us to assume it's a frozen wasteland. The Twin Cities would have been prime targets for the nukes, and the brutal winters in this state would have made the fallout unbearable for survivors. Mississippi. Mississippi shows up only in two brief terminal entries found in the wasteland. General Brock's terminal in Fort Strong mentions sending launchers to a supply yard in Mississippi before the war, while another terminal in the Parlor describes a pre-war fictional story about a girl from small-town Mississippi moving to the big city. But sitting along the Gulf Coast, the state would have faced severe flooding and hurricane damage after the bombs fell. The result would have been a poisoned, swamp-heavy landscape that's far too dangerous to support large, organized communities. Nebraska. The only post-war mention of Nebraska was as a fake scenery for a vault. Vault 33's telescopic projector loops images of the Nebraskan countryside to comfort the dwellers. So there's really not a lot of lore surrounding the state, but there are highly plausible and interesting fan speculations online. One is connected to Nebraska having a lot of plains. After getting nuked, the state would be one gigantic and toxic land, full of shallow craters, leaving no incentive for anyone to live there. So pretty much an isolated piece of land. The other strong theory is that because there aren't many urban centers in Nebraska, a strong city-sized community never would have formed there. Survivors would have been sparse. New Hampshire. New Hampshire's presence comes almost entirely through a railroad company that operated before the war. The NH and M Freight operated between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, with boxcars scattered around the Commonwealth. Being next to Boston meant New Hampshire probably got hit hard by fallout, even if it avoided direct strikes. North Carolina. The state's only presence in the post-war wasteland comes from health dispensers manufactured by Lee Rapid Pharmaceuticals, a Charlotte company whose medical supplies still show up in places like Operation Anchorage. Beyond that, we don't know anything about North Carolina. However, we can assume that the presence of Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune would have made the state a definite military target, while coastal flooding probably destroyed the Outer Banks, leaving the state split between irradiated military zones and isolated Appalachian communities. Oklahoma. The state's main appearance in Fallout comes from a Vault Tech marketing letter. The letter specifically mentions Oklahoma as one of the exciting locales where Vault Tech built facilities, suggesting at least some Vault infrastructure existed there. Now, Oklahoma is in a pretty good location, and it would have been spared from the heaviest coastal strikes. However, Tinker Air Force Base near Oklahoma City would have definitely been hit by nukes. On top of that, the state's oil fields made it a strategic target. South Carolina. This state shows up only on an MRE found in the Lonesome Road expansion, and honestly, if you're not paying attention, it's so easy to miss. Now, there's not much we know about the state, but in real life, Charleston's historic naval base and ports would have made it a prime target, while the state's low-lying coastline likely suffered catastrophic flooding. South Carolina would have been an irradiated coastal ruin. South Dakota. South Dakota's only appearance in Fallout is Robert McCready making a vague joke about that warehouse in South Dakota when exploring Good Neighbor. Now, since there's not much information about this state in the game, we can assume that the real-world sparse population and wide-open plains of the state probably helped it avoid the concentrated destruction that hit the coasts. Unfortunately, its Cold War missile silos and strategic air command facilities would have made it a definite target, which leaves the landscape probably dotted with blast craters across otherwise empty grassland. Tennessee. Tennessee appears through scattered cultural references that hint at what survived the war. For example, the Memphis Kid outfit worn by the Kings Gang in Freeside references Memphis and Elvis Presley's hometown, suggesting that Tennessee's musical legacy somehow made it through the apocalypse. An observations note from travelers described traversing a mountain trail in Tennessee where the wind carries a fine gray powder which clings to my face and hair. This is likely ash, which suggests that fires or industrial damage still affect the region's air quality decades later. But beyond that, there's not much information about the state. Washington. Washington State's entire presence after the Great War came from a piece of junk mail. It was from Rockwell Clearinghouse in Walla Walla, Washington. That's everything we know. But purely speculating this, Seattle would have been a priority target because it was a major urban and technological hub. The complete silence from the Pacific Northwest suggests whatever happened there left nothing organized enough to communicate with the rest of the wasteland, or the region became so isolated that survivors simply never made contact. And that's the fate of every US state in the Fallout universe. Did your state make the list? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Fallout lore dives.